So, hi, I'm Chantalamy Osman, and I am here with my friend Sushi, and we are going to talk about a genre. And to give you a little bit of backstory, I first met her in, I'm going to say, what, 2008? What year were you?
No, it was probably 2016 that
Oh,
I
no,
was.
it was earlier than that. I'm
Was it?
sure, because, yeah,
Oh, before, yeah, maybe. I don't
I
remember
think let's
exactly the
split the
year. Yeah.
difference. Okay, so early in, let's say, 2014, we'll make this up, splitting the difference. When she was a writer in residence at the Virginia Piper Center for Creative Writing at Arizona State University, I was on faculty and she was the writer in residence, and we met when they held their annual conference. And having experience with genre writing versus literary programs, I knew that this fancy woman who runs these many MFAs and has written these amazing literary novels would immediately look down upon the mystery sci-fi genre writer and teacher who was going to meet her. And to my surprise, we hit it off like a house on fire. Fast forward, several years later, we worked together at her Authors at Large program. I teach genre internationally with and for her. We've combined our classes many times. She generally teaches, fiction and literary writing. And based on our weird and random and generally wine-filled discussions, we have come to a detente between the literary writing and the genre writing, and have combined our methods in ways that I know that I have benefited greatly from. So today she's going to talk a lot, and we're going to be in discussion about genre writing and how it's influenced her other works. So now I will turn it over momentarily to you.
Thank you, Chantel. Well, certainly meeting Chantel was it was like this amazing ray of light, because in a way, I teach in MFA programs. I write what they call literary works that don't sell that much, but at the same time, I think about genre in terms of that's where most of us began. I started reading mystery when I was young, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to become a writer. At the time, I thought I'd, create a detective, I'd become a mystery novelist. And of course, that isn't the direction I went. I went down the MFA path, but I wound up writing like lots of stories that I realized that what works very often in fiction is understanding the techniques from mystery and suspense. For me, that was the one that I knew the best. But I had read some thriller also, and everybody reads some fantasy, some sci-fi. And I understood more and more, and especially when I started teaching. I've been teaching now about 20 years in creative writing. I realized that we're borrowing all the time from these different genres, both in terms of technique and actually even in terms of what our stories are. But I wasn't able to actually synthesize that very well until I met Chantel and her crowd of writers. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, here's this whole other world, because, I do book launches, I go on reading tours, I go to universities and all, and it's a very different world than the world she's in. But in sort of exchanging ideas and chatting and having a lot of wine-filled evenings, I learned a lot more about that. So that was why when she said, let's do this masterclass, this apocalypse masterclass, I said, well, why don't I talk about, the aspects of genre that sort of inform literary fiction in terms of the techniques, in terms of, the aspects of genre. Because really, to me, genre is where all storytelling begins. I mean, that's what John Gardner, The Art of Fiction, which is one of our Bible books, says. It's like, the first thing a writer has to determine when she's starting a story or trying to write a story is what genre she's writing. And he basically says, well, what do you like to read? If you read, crime, you'll write a crime story. If you read, and that ultimately is what it is. So I thought maybe today we could look at some what they call literary fiction examples that really borrow heavily from different genres.
Well, and I think that that's something that, based on our discussions, I've changed my way of teaching, really, because I don't think that there's any rule in any genre that doesn't inform your writing in any other genre. Like, even if you're not writing a mystery, if you know those basic tenets of the genre, same thing with everything else, you know, it can only inform your writing and improve your writing. You and I have discussed this regarding the Authors at Large program, and I'm going to sneeze. I'm not contagious. It's just allergies. They're bad here. So we've talked many times about how when the Authors at Large program or any sort of like MFA style program is broken up into disciplines, that sometimes that can be less effective, because I would like to, I took some of Ira's classes and some of your classes in Thailand, and I went, oh, these exercises, these things that you're saying can definitely help my writers in these ways. Like, for example, I say, you know, if you're bad at writing dialogue, read a screenwriting book, take a screenwriting class, because that revolves heavily about that. If you're bad at description, take a poetry class, because then you only have, you know, a few words to describe something, and it can only hone, even if you're not going to be a poet. Sampling all of these other things, other genres, other styles, you're only bringing back more tools to your tool belt that you're using in whatever it is that you're writing.
Exactly. And one thing I have found in teaching MFAs over the years is that when I first started teaching, people wrote more what we think of as that sort of workshop literary fiction. It's always about relationships. It's always about certain issues and ideas that, and they tend to be very realistic stories. But there's been a real shift. I've seen a lot more of what I would call speculative or a kind of science fiction coming through. I certainly see a lot more of what at one time would be dismissed as sort of romance novels, because essentially, you know, when you think about, you know, relationships and stories about that, what is a rom-com if not, you know, Jane Austen? You know, I mean, Jane Austen, as I told one of my students a long time ago, who's now actually somebody who teaches with us, you know, she said, I don't know, this novel I'm writing, it seems too lightweight, it's all romance. I said, you know, Jane Austen was romance. That's not there, you know. All the classic novels that we think of in literature actually is so much about marriage, so much about love. What is that if not a romance story at the end of the day, you know?
Well, and everything, I always say to my students, like, take a class in mystery writing, because every book is a mystery, because guess what? We don't know how it ends. If I read a diet book, it's also a mystery, because will somebody lose weight by the end of it? Like, it's always a mystery.
That's the most interesting way of talking about a diet book I've ever. But you know, if you think about something like Doris Lessing, for example, who won the Nobel Prize in literature. At one point in her life, out of sheer frustration, she decided to write under a pseudonym, and she wrote under the name Jane Summers. And one of the novels she wrote under that name was Love Again. You know, and so many of her books were really, on some level, a kind of romance story, but perhaps not Harlequin, but it's still about relationships.
I'm editing a literary novel right now, and if I had to say anything, I'd say it's a romance, because it's about these various failed relationships. And so guess what that is? It's just a little bit more, how shall I put it, to not offend the literary people, because I don't want to be offended as a genre person, but tends to be a little bit, it's like genre plus navel gazing equal.
Yeah, well, that's actually, so what makes something literary? And if you want, I could talk about a few examples.
Go ahead.
Maybe, and then we can go through them. I've divided into like 4 of the genres that I thought might be worth looking at. One was crime mystery, the second is suspense thriller, the third is fantasy, and the fourth is sci-fi. So let's start with crime mystery, because that's the one that actually was the thing that got me writing anyway. So I have 3 novels here that I'll talk a little bit about. The first one is called Siam, The Woman Who Shot a Man, and it's by Lily Tuck. Lily Tuck won, I think it was either the National Book Award or Pulitzer for Paraguay, one of her other novels. And she's very much what you would call a literary novel. And here's a very interesting thing. It's also somewhat historical, this novel, but she takes the case of a real person, Jim Thompson, who was the Silk King of Thailand, who one day literally...
Oh, yes, I went to his house, yes.
Yes, he walks out of his... Well, it was, he was visiting some friends in the Cameron Highlands in Malaysia. He walks out, and he disappears, and you never see him again. And the way Lily Tuck approaches this is she has this character, this American woman who's there with her husband, and they meet Jim Thompson at a dinner party. And of course, that part's made up, that's just fiction. But shortly thereafter, he disappears. And so she comes back to the store to try to find him. But ultimately, the story is not about that mystery. That's just, the mystery just starts it. And in the end, it's really more about the mystery of her own marriage and her own relationship with her husband. And that's how she approaches it. Now, she does, one of the things that perhaps makes her more of the navel-gazer, if you want to call it that. The thing about a book like hers is that she engages in a great deal of historical research. And of course, it's the intersection of history and fiction and nonfiction. But the difference that I find in what we call the sort of kind of literary approach is that the history is secondary. And just like the Jim Thompson mystery, I think you wouldn't see a whole lot about Jim Thompson, just a little bit. It happens at the beginning, and then it sort of fades away because it's not the important thing. And that's something that we see in a lot of literary novels, where you have something that seems like, if it were a more commercial novel, for example, would be the story. It's not.
So what you're saying is that the inciting incident is used simply as that in a literary novel. Yeah. And it's not like in a genre, if that's the mystery and that's the inciting incident, that's probably going to continue throughout the book. Yes. But literally just used in literary as a jumping off point.
In her case, yeah. And she's done this in her other novels as well. So it's something of a technique she uses. So that's one example. The second one is a much shorter novel. It's a very thin novel called A Separation, a novel by Katie Kitamura. And she is a fascinatingly interesting young writer. I say young, at this point she's not that young anymore. When I first met her, she was quite young. She writes very beautifully. The thing about her work is that it's incredibly spare. I'll give you the setup of the story. So this couple are separated. The husband and wife have lived apart. She's a translator, he's a researcher of some kind, an academic of some kind. And he goes away on a trip to Greece. She doesn't even know where he is because they're actually not living together. And then her mother-in-law calls her. And it's clear that the mother-in-law has no idea that they're separated. And she's worried. And she knows that her husband is in Greece and she herself doesn't even know. So she's like, okay. So she, without telling her mother-in-law all of it, she decides to go to Greece to find her husband. So she goes to the hotel because the mother-in-law knew where the hotel was. She arrives there and discovers that he's been gone for 3 days and hasn't come back. That's how it starts.
There's a very similar setup in a Mary Stewart book. And I read, I grew up reading Mary Stewart, which weirdly they now categorize more as romance, which they weren't at all. These were women who, they didn't like their husband or something, then husband disappears, then they go to Greece to try to find them at a hotel, whatever it is. And then they find out like he was always a spy all along and he's dead now. And, she runs off with the clerk at the hotel, whatever it is. But there's always this mystery and it's always set up the same way. And everybody, and it's just so funny. And talking to you about these books, it makes it even clearer to me that there's, I don't want to say prejudice about genre, but really people are given such expectations that when they read a genre book, they go, oh, it's almost too much fun. And
well, yeah, I know. I know
what you're saying there. Yeah. But it's a lot about how it's packaged and how you're primed before you even open the book. Exactly. What shelf is it on in the library, bookstore, whatever. That's telling me certain things about it. And if I took the book that you just described and put it next to a Mary Stewart book from the 70s, I don't know that anybody would, or vice versa, I could flip them. And I don't know that anybody would really know unless I had primed them with the way we design covers for certain genres, the way, what shelf it's on, that sort of thing.
What was interesting to me when I remember when I started reading this, I thought, oh, surely some romance writer has already done this. It seems like such a standard setup in any romance story, But of course, what what makes, and it's like a typical mystery kind of thing too, even like a mystery where, you know, you expect to see your spouse and the spouse has disappeared. I mean, that seems like a really classic setup in mystery. Except that what becomes the story is really, yeah, partly about the husband, but it's really about the woman in the end. It's her story, and it becomes her ability to separate in the end fully from this husband. I won't tell you the ending of it or what because that would kind of spoil it in a way. But you know, she goes through this time and she realizes, she knows her husband is a very flirtatious guy, so she almost even expects that maybe he has a girlfriend there or something like that. And she keeps looking around for some sign of this, but all signs don't seem to lead to anything.
Interesting.
And that's the way this, and one of the things about her work, which makes her quote unquote literary, is her very, very spare prose. It's really tight. She wrote another book before that, which got her quite a lot of attention, which was about fighters, about kickboxers or something like this, and it's very spare, and you know, she does, and this is just her style. You know, this is just the way she writes, and she's made a kind of name for herself that way.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean,
no,
and to go to a genre example, Elmore Leonard is something that he can say more in 5 words than most writers can in a chapter.
Yeah,
like he just,
and her dialogue is like that too. It's like a very, and again, we think a lot of mystery writing has that very, you know, these private eyes and detectives are always, you know, people of little, you know, men, especially men of, you know, very few words, right? So, and she does that beautifully throughout this. So in a way, I actually think she's actually borrowing a lot from genre, you know. And the last example of crime mystery is a book that I've loved for a long, long time by a writer who is now dead, and he's tends to be known in the literary world and nowhere else. His name is Evan S. Connell, and the book that I'm thinking of is something called The Diary of a Rapist, which is
I know that book.
Charming sounding title, you know. I have a copy of it here. Just hold it up. You know, as you can see, all the stickers I've bought from it many times. He's a brilliant writer, very unusual writer, and he was one of the rare literary writers who did not spend his time teaching in MFA programs. In fact, I think he would have hated anything like that. He just wrote. He wrote for a living, and he wrote as a result many different genres. He wrote a lot of nonfiction. He did historical work. He wrote about artists. He wrote novels, and they're all different. You know, they're quite different. But he had a fascination with sort of obsessive personalities. And so The Diary of a Rapist is about a man who commits a rape. But you know that going in. So the crime, the rape, is told to you already because you know that's who it is. But what you do is you watch him justify it all the way through. And when he actually commits it, it's like you barely see anything because it's all it's told in diary form, and then it moves on. And it's really a character study in the end. You know, it's a very dark book, obviously. He got panned for it, I remember, in the New York Times when it first appeared. But ultimately, you know, his reputation has since survived, and he's become somebody that's really important. He's better known for a pair of companion novels called Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, which became a movie at one point where they combined the 2 books. So those are the 3 that I just wanted to share. And I'll leave a list of these books that we talk about with Chantel. But that was, you know, I don't know, the diary form must be used in genre writing, I would imagine.
Sure. So as I'm listening to you describe how, which you're absolutely right, every one of these instances borrows heavily from genre fiction, I'm trying to figure out what the differences actually are, because you and I have spent several years finding all the similarities. So now what is that difference? And so I think that it was really brilliant when you were saying about, you know, the inciting incident is not used. And I think that the second factor that you're now discussing, especially with the last book, is that it's a character study in the end.
Yes. In the end,
most genre is primarily plot.
Plot, yes.
Now, here's what's funny. As I was processing this while you were talking, not that I wasn't listening, but I was thinking about what you'd said. the one thing, especially in mystery, the mystery overall crime fiction genre, is that there's a form that's looked down upon, which we call cozy mystery or traditional mystery. And it's often those ones that somebody has, it's a woman, it's generally always
Yes, generally a woman,
has
yes.
some job, like she's an interior decorator, she's a chef, she works at a wine shop, she pick your profession, stumbles across a dead body. This propels her to investigate for generally no apparent reason, but she's bored. And then, you know, this becomes a series. And the thing is that people look very much down, even in if you're in crime fiction. I mean, I've heard people say to me, well, you know, you publish cozies, like with that disdain. And I said, you know, I don't read a lot of them. But I said, I defy you, author who has written one noir novel, which is, it's really easy. It's kind of like in acting. You know, it's easier to make somebody cry than somebody laugh. Exactly. It's really easy to put somebody on a path to destruction. Like, that's not hard to write. You know, this guy who makes one bad choice and then suddenly, you know, is buried.
Goes downhill.
Right. That's pretty easy. I can figure that out real fast. What I think is a lot more challenging is generally these are all series. So, I mean, we could even, for an example, take Janet Ivanovich, even though she's just a little bit, she's got a little bit of romance. There's a lot of genres going on there, but I can take that one. But how easy is it to write 20 plus books
well, that's
in the same small town with the same set of characters? And I think that's way harder than writing one novel.
I think that's an amazingly hard thing to do. I grew up reading Enid Blyton and after that Agatha Christie. And the reason was, I mean, it was very comforting to keep, and they, you know, Blyton, of course, was children's books, and, you know, Naughty and Toyland was the one that I used to like. And then when I got older, it was all the Mallory Towers, all the, you know, boarding school things. But it led me to Agatha Christie because Miss Marple, who is in this little town where all these deaths happen, is what you would probably call cozy mystery, right? But there was something fascinating about that. And it was, one of the things I really learned from her was how to make a character memorable. Because, you know, of course, Miss Marple was the detective, if you like. But it was the way Miss Marple could always connect one person to another. She would compare them. And I always thought, this is amazing. And as I started writing more fiction, I would think, now, I need a character who does this. And I would always think about people I knew who had some of those characteristics. And essentially, that's how you write character, you know?
Well, that's where I'm going with this, because these cozy mysteries that people are looking down on, they're the character driven of the lot.
Very character driven. Yes.
And I do this, it's one of my favorite things to do when I teach a class, especially if I'm talking about writing crime or mystery, is I will say, you know, who read a book or watched, you know, even take a TV series that's a crime, because we all watch those. And, you know, everybody raises their hand. And then I said, okay, who can actually raise their hand and tell me what the clue was that led to the solution of the mystery? And nobody can raise their hand, because they're reading it. Yeah, sure, that's in there. But that genre bit of it, you know, you have to lay the clues.
Right.
Is so little of what we're actually reading. We're reading and we're going back for those characters. We're going for the place. We're going for so really, even though, again, I'm finding that the character driven is a difference between genre and literary, but it's also not.
It's not always. It depends what you're talking about. Yeah. So why don't we look at suspense thriller, because that's where plot is a big question. So I picked two. One is Look at Me by Jennifer Egan. She's the one who wrote Visit from the Goon Squad that won the Pulitzer. And the other one is Bel Canto by Anne Patchett.
Oh, sure.
Look at Me is, I'll just give you a quick setup. It's an earlier book of hers, which I really like. It's about a model who's in an accident. And when she has her face reconstructed, and so her face gets all banged up and everything else. And so when her face is reconstructed, she comes back to New York and everybody doesn't seem to see her. She's almost become like invisible. So as a result, it becomes a story. So it's kind of a mystery. It's kind of like, why is it nobody seems to recognize her? But she still looks the same,
Mm-hmm.
but there's just something slightly different about her. So this allows her then to sort of rethink who she is and what her life is. And the thing that happens in this book is that this book was actually, it sort of predicted 9/11. It came out before 9/11. And it has a setup in it that is very similar to what happened in 9/11, with these people were, studying to be pilots, and they decide to go and crash a plane and all that. So she has a character like that who could very easily have been one of the people on those planes, one of those suicide, pilots, who flew the plane into like the World Trade Center, which is quite remarkable that she managed to write this in the midst of all this, in a story about a model whose face has changed. So I suppose there, the thing that, here you have a plot, you have a kind of sexy industry modeling, but all of that sort of disappears. I mean, the fact that she's had this accident, this is post-accident is where it begins. She's come back to New York and nobody knows who she is. So the accident and all that doesn't matter. And even the sexy industry she's in becomes really a much lesser thing. And this is very much all about her then in the end, But even with the plot, with her encountering this guy who is, one of these suicide bomber types, that becomes less the issue than this idea that it's really almost like a book of ideas. This is the idea of who are we if when people look at us, they don't see us anymore. It becomes a philosophical inquiry, which is very much the path of a lot of literary books, and even like A Visit from the Goon Squad on some level is a philosophical inquiry as well. And so I suppose that's part of what maybe makes a book literary. I can't be sure, because I think that I got a lot of philosophy out of Sherlock Holmes as well.
Yeah.
So that
I
was
do think it's where that focus lies. I think we're seeing that similarity throughout these. It's like, the inciting incident, the plot might be the same, but it's what the author focuses on. Is it solving that inciting incident, or is it something internal to the character? And I think generally the literary is the internal to the character answer.
But then here's another one where you have a large cast of characters, so the internal story isn't as much a part of it. It's bel canto. And this is a hostage situation in a country very much like Peru. It's South America. He doesn't say Peru, but it might as well be, because that's where you have a Japanese prime minister, and in this one too, you have that same sort of setup, okay? So the occasion is the birthday party of this Japanese industrialist who loves opera, and he has flown out this famous opera singer to sing for his birthday party, and it opens with her on stage, and then the lights go out, and it's very, very early, like in the first chapter, they've been taken hostage by this group of rebels, So now you have this large international cast of characters who all speak different languages, Japanese, and then there's a translator and all that, and the brilliance here is that the situation is very quickly established. So you have everything, a hostage situation is just, to me, a real suspense or thriller kind of novel, right? But what makes this book really, it's all about music, it's all about language. And how she does it is that to be able to have all these different characters, and it's a very good, I use this book a lot for teaching the omniscient narrator. This is the one, because she has so many characters. She has to enter into everybody's head just a little bit. So there are a few characters that become the main characters, but how do you go in and out so quickly with all these different people? You have the rebels, you have the hostages, you have people from Europe, you have people from South America, you have people from Asia, and they don't all speak the same language. She has a translator as one of the main characters, and the translator becomes the interlocutor between culture and languages. So it becomes ultimately a study of language and music, and how this sort of it becomes more important than the actual hostage situation itself, the hostage situation is just the excuse to tell the story of this very large global set of characters. To me, it was a very prescient book in some ways in terms of how global the world is now and how when we're all banged up against each other, what's going to happen. Because the COVID situation has put us in a hostage situation where people, okay, so I traveled back from Lisbon, but you know, some of my group was stuck there, and then they were all going to different countries and they couldn't fly back because of all of this. So suddenly we all have to somehow figure out how to work this out with different protocols, different everything else. In a way, this book could be a lesson for that. But part of it too is the book is about the bel canto, which is a form of music, and she obviously is very much she loves that kind of music, and she's able to teach us about music through the book as well. It's a very beautifully written book. The language, her language, is probably one of the things that people take away from it a great deal. And this one won the Penn Faulkner Award. Yeah. So that was it. But the situation is one that I would readily expect in a thriller novel.
I thought of Death on the Nile or Murder on the Orient Express. You basically have a locked room mystery.
It's a locked room mystery. That's exactly what this is.
With people who, at least on the surface, appear to have never met or not know each other.
They don't know each other very well at all. Yeah. Because they're like diplomats, journalists, what have you, you know.
Exactly. And so often, you know, in the two Christie examples I just cited, they don't know each other there either. You know, it's, or at least we don't know what their connection is, or they don't know what their connection is until later. So the setup, again, is absolutely straight out of something.
Out of mystery, out of thrillers, you know. So that's one. Okay, 2 fantasy novels, and I don't have copies of the books. I read this both on, they're fairly recent. I read them both on Kindle. One is called Memoirs of a Polar Bear by Yoko Tawada. This is an outrageous book. Now, Yoko Tawada is a really interesting writer. She's Japanese, as you can tell from her name, but she writes in both Japanese and German.
Really?
Yes. This book was actually written in German and translated. So Memoirs of a Polar Bear is literally that. It's the memoir of a polar bear. But it's a very unusual polar bear because he tells the story of, it's a polar bear who can speak. And the thing about, you know, as obviously this is fantasy, right? It's completely fantastical. And you have the history of who he was and how he was born and what his life was and how he goes through life. You know, he was a circus bear at one time. And on one level, it's also sort of satirizing the problems of, he becomes a star because he starts writing this memoir, you know, and it satirizes sort of fame, and especially global fame, because he then decides, no, I want to he gets moved to Germany, where they say, oh, you're a star, we're bringing you as like a writer in residence or something like that. And then he finds that he doesn't like it in Germany and he wants to go to Canada, you know, because he's read about Canada. So on one level, it's very satirical, but on another level, it's just incredibly outrageous. But right off the bat, you know, you're just expected to walk into this fantasy world and believe it, because instead of sort of setting up a whole, she doesn't have to do a lot of she is doing world building. She's doing a lot of world building throughout the novel, because you very quickly understand what life is like for this polar bear, you know, and the fact that his being able to speak made him kind of an outcast, you know, and that's one of the things that makes it so interesting as a book. And she's become quite a literary star, you know. I mean, her work is just incredible, and she does a lot of what I would call sci-fi. She has another one that's kind of like a time zone thing, you know, another story like that. She's got another one called The Bridegroom Was a Dog. That one was written in Japanese. Now, Memoirs of a Polar Bear is a slightly longer book, but Bridegroom Was a Dog was a very thin little book. And I just happened upon her work one day at one of these book fairs, and now I realize she's become really huge in a certain literary community. So there's one where the outrageousness is just treated like the everyday.
Well, and
And
so
that's a way you can do that in fantasy. I'm sure.
Well, I think that the difference, again, I'm playing spot the difference for some reason on my end. But if you told that book from the viewpoint of a fantasy author, they would say my book is about a talking polar bear who goes on adventures. And if it's a literary author who's describing the same book, they'd probably say this book is a treatise on fame.
Yes.
Told through the eyes of a certain
polar
bear.
bear.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
And so it would be that different angle.
It's that difference, yeah. Because in the end, there's a book about, it's quite a good book about the problems of fame, problems of celebrity, Now the other one, which draws on the legend of the Little Mermaid, is this wonderful novel called The Mermaid's Daughter by Anne Claycomb. And I just stumbled on this book, how things come up and you see a review, and I thought, what is this? And I've always loved Hans Christian Andersen. I love fairy tales, And hey, isn't that where we all start? And isn't that the kind of
and there's so much not Disney. I mean, they are really interesting if you get
exactly. And I read the original Little Mermaid. The Disney version drives me crazy because it's a very dark book. Actually, it's a very dark story.
Most fairy tales are.
They are, exactly. And this novelist has taken The Mermaid's Daughter as a story of what if the Little Mermaid had a daughter? Now, she's half mermaid, right? Or part mermaid, except that by this time, the mermaid has legs. So what happens to that genesis, that generations after that? And these are several generations of the mermaid's daughters. The daughter, the granddaughter, the great-granddaughter. And one of the strange things about all of them is they have a propensity for wanting to go to water and to the sea.
You don't
Guess why?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of death involved in it too. It becomes it's a sparklingly brilliant book because she's taken this old fairy tale and really given it new life, but not by a lot of what I see in terms of sort of fantasy in the literary world is a sort of retelling of fairy tales. This is much more than that. She's taken it and taken off with it and created a whole new storyline to the present day, starting with the present day of a girl who is descended from the original Little Mermaid. So that was the one that I thought was kind of a new face on an old legend, an old story. That was quite interesting.
It reminds me, as you were telling me this, it reminds me of two other, which were books and then movies, Practical Magic and The Red Violin.
The Red Violin, yes. This is sort of Red Violin-ish, yeah.
Well, and Practical Magic too, because it's generations of New England witches, but it's not a book about being a witch. It's not a book about magic. It's a book about, family and exploring and getting out from under certain, past, which is exactly what it sounds like the Mermaid's Daughters are doing.
Exactly.
Just kind of how it's couched in that here's a standard trope that we know, magic, mermaid, whatever it is. And then let's see how we're exploring it. Is it about solving that, or is it about how people are dealing with it themselves?
Well, one interesting thing is, of course, the original Little Mermaid, she could walk on these new legs, but they gave her terrible pain. There was like knives going into her. So these women all at some point suffer this mysterious pain in their legs that they cannot, the doctors can't do anything with it. Of course, we're in the present day, so the doctors want to figure it out. So it also speaks to so many new medical situations that people come up against that are sort of inexplicable,
Well, and also, especially if it's told from a female point of view, I mean, it's well documented that most doctors won't,
listen to women.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that certainly, brings that to light as well.
Well, famously, Amy Tan actually got Lyme's disease, and she wrote about it because here she is, Amy Tan, one of the most famous, authors in the world, one of the wealthiest, a really well-known author. And she couldn't get her doctor to believe that she was sort of like losing her memory and something was wrong. And, the doctor was just like, dismissive about it. And she wrote a really interesting essay about that for the New York Times, you know. So yes, definitely, what women have to deal with when they have maladies that are a little hard to explain. It's
Yeah.
always quickly dismissed as, oh, it must be something psychological, you know, or it's whatever, you know. So that's that. Finally, the sci-fi, which is of course the big one. Well, famously, Kazuo Ishiguro, Never Let Me Go, which is about clones that think they're human and they're being harvested for their organs. Now, this reads almost like a school story, like a Harry Potter for clones, okay, on some level. And it's very reminiscent of an English boarding school. But Ishiguro is, he's Japanese, but he moved to the UK at quite a young age. And he's best known for the novel The Remains of the Day, which became a very well-known movie, okay? But he's very much a literary writer. But one of the things he does is that with each of his books, he tries to take on a genre. So this one was sci-fi. He has a mystery one that's set in Shanghai. He has a fantasy one about giants. Now that's the one I didn't read. But he takes on genre because he finds it a challenge to write what he writes. And each book is very much him, you know, he has a very, very strong voice. And here's what I can say about this situation of these clones who are being created, and they go through life thinking they're human, okay, until they have to at some point be taken away, and this is where they're going to be harvested, their organs harvested. They don't completely understand, nobody quite tells them, so they're in a sort of semi-prison boarding school situation. And what's interesting, in a lot of sci-fi, the science is very important. In this one, the science is it's practically absent. Mm-hmm. It's not important. All you need to know is these are clones, you know? And it comes out, it's not told to you right away, but it becomes apparent after a while. And then of course, now that it's a movie, it's all there, you know? But that was one of the things. And he has a very quiet style. If you know Remains of the Day at all, it's that same kind of quietude. His books are famous for their quietude, you know, and that's what he is all about. And yeah, Ishiguro is definitely somebody that you cannot not call literary, you know, and yet he openly acknowledges that he's using genre, you know. So I think he's one of the best examples. And this sci-fi, this has become close to my favorite. I have another book of his that I think is my favorite, but that's the one that it's his third book, The Unconsoled, that is really a writer's book. You know, it's a book for writers, I think, you know, and it's not as popular a book, but I think it speaks to the psychology of being an artist of any kind. Whereas Never Let Me Go, I think, is the one I really love as a story, because it just captivated me. At first I thought, wait, well, what is this? You know, but I actually knew what the plot was before I read it. But the plot doesn't matter, which is interesting. The plot really doesn't matter. It is the sadness that these children, because they never grow old, you know, they don't grow beyond a certain age. The sadness that these kids have, these clones whom you read as if they are human, you know, that's the brilliance, I think, of the book.
Well, and again, I think also, you know, it's a great author example of this, because especially like with Remains of the Day, what we were talking about before with romantic comedies and everything.
Oh, that is the ultimate romantic comedy. Yeah.
Well, Remains of the Day, it's like you took the genre and then you made it introspective and quiet.
Yes.
But it's kind of stripping some of that, I don't want to say bells and whistles or plot, but like in this book that you're mentioning, the science, dogs, the science doesn't matter. Hey, I don't need your thoughts on genre, thank you. But it's like you've stripped it down, and it's just how people are perceiving what's going on around them, as opposed to seeing all of that noise that's existing in the world.
Exactly.
It's stripping it down to just whoever the protagonist is, or various protagonists.
Well, Remains of the Day is basically an unrequited love story.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what could be.
But I mean, if you were writing that as a genre book, you wouldn't have to change a lot, but there are things you would have to
change, yes.
Change and focus on, and it would not be as quiet. It would not be as introspective.
Yeah. I think the quietness is the quietude is the thing that is different. And so the last one I'll talk about is very much a sci-fi story. It's called The Story of Your Life. It's in a collection of stories called The Story of Your Life and Other Stories. And it's fairly new, this book. It's a couple of years old, maybe. It's Ted Chiang. So he's a Chinese-American writer. And here there is a lot of science, a whole lot of science. And it's, on the one hand, a story of a child who has died, and so the parents want to tell the story of their life to the child. And but here's the setup. The parents are this couple who worked on a UFO that arrived on Earth, where there were these heptapods, and the wife is a linguist, and the husband is a scientist, like a rocket scientist, okay? And that's how they meet. And they want to try to tell the story to their child of how they met. But this was a top secret thing, so they couldn't talk about it. Mm-hmm. But there's this entire science that is made up around linguistics, and it's interesting, but it's the science of linguistics more than anything else. Linguistics and physics, okay, are the two things that you see in there. And the writer is himself something of a geek, okay? He knows his science. He knows what he's talking about. But the story is about love and family, and what the charge of their job when they were there was to try to make contact and to understand what these heptapods wanted, because they just showed up on Earth. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't figure out why. And of course, all the politicians are thinking, oh, this could be an invasion, what do they want, or anything else. But the scientists who work with them over time just realize that they're just here observing, and they learn something about their life and how they eat and how and they're funny looking because they look like these pods with like legs, you know. And he describes it very much. I can see this as a movie. I really can. But this is a real genre bender in literary fiction, because it is clearly sci-fi, but he has gotten a lot of accolades in the literary world for the book. And it is a powerful book. It's a great deal about human emotion, about family, and about love, you know? And I mean, the husband and wife meet under these circumstances, and they do get divorced later. But this is the one thing that they share, that you can never be separated from them. It's actually very funny. The way I found out about this story was one of my students who writes sci-fi mentioned it and said, I want to study that for my next critical paper. I said, okay, and I thought, I better read this. So I went and looked it up, and I was completely blown away by it. So what I can say is that clearly more so-called literary writers are seeking to, because in a modern technological age, you know, science fiction is actually the most interesting genre to be writing about, to be exploring. What are the scientific possibilities in the world? Looking at technology, looking at medicine, looking at, you know, space travel, all of this. It's all real now. So I can see why it becomes fodder for fiction writers. We've seen a lot more of it recently. We definitely have.
Well, and it's interesting because, you know, if you talk to a lot of physicists or scientists, so many of them actually have been influenced in one way or another by having read something, and then they're like, ooh, this is what I want to create in the world. Yes. So it's kind of an interesting feedback loop. I tweeted the other day that I have had almost every author that I have ever met in the last month say to me, I wrote about this pandemic X number of years ago.
Exactly.
And so
Yeah.
I've said to all of them, you know, well, please start writing, we all recover and everything is fine. Fiction is good, because obviously if you feel you've created this pandemic, you have the power to fix it. Everybody has said that to me, and I'm like, well, yeah, that's, you know, that's how, well, not particularly this, but especially with the scientific breakthroughs, so many of them have been influenced by something you've read or something you've watched, which was, of course, at some point written. So,
well, everybody's talking about 1984 these days. Everybody's talking about how the world has changed around us and how what was just imagined once is now becoming so real, you know? So, I mean, Ray Bradbury was basically writing about holographs in his time, you know? So, yeah, I became exposed to a lot more science fiction as a result of my students while writing it. The youngest students they all read it too. They find it much more, you know, and they're all influenced by Star Trek and, you know, all the cinema and television shows that have led to this, you know, so.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting.
More of it.
And I think, you know, obviously write whatever you want and call it whatever you want, but I think that all of these, like, none of them is better than the other one, you know, and each one can inform the other and bring even stronger, you know, the examples you just gave that are obviously influenced by genre fiction could only happen if we had genre fiction. So it's a good thing to read and study and explore, and how you implement it is up to you as a writer.
Yeah.
But they're all tools that you can use, and interesting things to try and worlds to explore.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll be giving me a list, which I will include in the notes of a potential reading list. And I will say thank you, and I will stop the recording, and then you and I can chat more.
Okay. Thank you, Chantel.
Oh, and also, if everybody enjoyed this class, I'm asking, obviously these are all for free. I mean, who would pay for me? But I would like you to give that money that you might have paid for a class like this in this time to a independent business near you, especially an independent bookstore, if you can.
Mm-hmm.
So, thanks. And
I would also pitch for, because one of the things that Ann Patchett did was she owns an independent bookstore. She started one. So you can go help her out. You know, she's still there. She's not given up on it.
Okay, good. So everybody stay happy, stay safe, and until the next masterclass.